Speaker, I'm very pleased to rise to speak on Bill C-47, an act to amend the Export and Import Permits Act and the Criminal Code. In essence, what Bill C-47 would do is implement the Arms Trade Treaty, which was signed by this government. Mr. Speaker, without more, I oppose Bill C-47 for two broad reasons. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I am not satisfied that the Arms Trade Treaty and Bill C-47, the implementation of that treaty, would actually strengthen Canada's arms control regime. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I oppose this bill because of serious concerns and questions that have been asked by law-abiding firearms owners and users in this country, concerns and questions, Mr. Speaker, that this government has refused to answer in terms of whether this legislation would result in a backdoor gun registry. And, Mr. Speaker, I will address, first of all, the issue about whether this bill actually strengthens Canada's arms control regime. The fact is that Canada has long had a very strong arms control regime. It is a regime that has been in place for about 70 years. It is a regime that is robust. Canada is a leader when it comes to arms control in terms of our export regime. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member for Durham in some detail highlighted what the scope of that regime is, it includes the Trade Controls Bureau, which has operated since 1947. What does the Trade Controls Bureau do? Mr. Speaker, it governs, it tracks, and it controls the export of military weapons and arms out of Canada. And it has worked very well. And under the import and export regime that Canada has with respect to arms control, the items that are controlled or subject to control are listed. They include military weapons, nuclear, chemical, biological materials, among other things. Mr. Speaker, of course, Canada doesn't just list those items that are subject to control. Canada tracks the export of controlled items. We track it by way of the CBSA, through Statistics Canada, and we track it in a very robust way and one that is consistent with international standards, including the World Customs Organization. That is the standard by which Canada tracks. Mr. Speaker, while Canada tracks, one of the things that is lacking in the Arms Trade Treaty, as the member for Durham correctly pointed out, is transparency, is tracking, and then we not only have the Trade Controls Bureau, we also have what is called an area control list that, by way of order in council, can block the export not only of weapons, but of anything from Canada to another country. Right now, North Korea is on that list. So what we have is, again, a very strong, a very robust regime. It is one that has worked. It is working. And Mr. Speaker, there are questions about whether this would, in fact, improve upon what Canada has, or whether in some respects it would water it down. And so I cannot support a piece of legislation that arguably would weaken the very good regime that Canada already has. Now, as has been raised by a number of honourable members in this House, there are serious questions about whether this bill would prove a backdoor re-establish a gun registry. We know, of course, what a disaster the long gun registry was, introduced by the previous Liberal government. It was a registry that targeted law-abiding firearms owners, that cost the taxpayers of Canada some $2 billion and did absolutely nothing to prevent firearms from getting into the hands of criminals. On the contrary, it in fact actually made the situation worse by creating a black market for various firearms. So, Mr. Speaker, when the firearms community unanimously, every firearms organization in Canada unanimously raises questions about whether this would impede upon law-abiding firearms owners by way of a backdoor firearms registry, I think those concerns have to be taken seriously. But instead of listening to the firearms community, instead of consulting with law-abiding firearms owners, this government would prefer just to dismiss them out of hand. I heard my friend, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the member for Fredericton, when he stood up in this House, and I respect that honourable member, but he made the assertion that the claim that it would create a backdoor gun registry was phony and bogus. Well, I say, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the language of the arms treaty, the Arms Trade Treaty, and Bill C-47. Let's start, Mr. Speaker, with Article 2. Article 2 states that this treaty shall apply to all conventional arms within the following categories, and then lists a whole series of categories. And when you get to the end, when you get to Article 2, sub 1, sub H, it refers to small arms. Small arms include any firearm or that could be operated and used by an individual. So it would include a rifle or any number of firearms that are lawfully used by Canadians for recreational purposes, for civilian recreational purposes, every single day. Now, we then go to Article 12, which says that each state party shall maintain national records pursuant to its national laws and regulations in terms of conventional arms covered under Article 2. As I mentioned, Article 2 includes small arms. And then, of course, we get to Bill C-47 and look at the substance of it, and we see that, among other things, other sections of this bill, Section 10.3 sub 6, which says that every person or organization under the Act, which would include a broker, is required to retain records for a period of some 6 years. For a period of some 6 years. And Bill C-47 goes a lot further than that, because it provides the specific manner in which those electronic records must be kept by way of an electronic database. And I see I'm out of time, but Mr. Speaker, it raises again very serious questions about this issue, and I'd be happy to pick up from where I left off in questions and answers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And comments. The honourable member for Canada Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his speech. But I really want to make sure that he understands that this treaty really deals with illicit conventional arms trades, and that illicit arms trade actually puts vulnerable people at risk around the world. And the ATT is the only treaty that really tries to tackle the issue of illicit arms trading. And my question to him is, how can Canada contribute to fighting illicit arms trade if we're not party to the only treaty that addresses this issue?
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would say it's simply put, it's not this bill. It's not a bill that targets potentially law-abiding firearms owners. You know, Mr. Speaker, as I alluded to, Canada has already a very robust regime in place, one that is working. And secondly, on the issue of whether it would establish a backdoor firearms registry, I guess one of the questions that I would have of this government is, where is the language in the treaty that would exclude firearms for civilian purposes? It's nowhere to be found. What we have are clauses that are vague, that are overly broad, that are ambiguous, and raise more questions than answers. And I say that the hunters, anglers, and fishermen of this country who use firearms for recreational purposes every single day deserve a lot more from this government.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech, and I just wanted to ask him through you if he might want to expand on some of the concerns we've heard here today around the fact that a lot of the important guts of this bill are going to be brought in as regulations after the bill receives royal assent, so that we won't hear them there. Regulations around some of the important criteria the minister will be obligated to use to assess these export applications.
Honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for that question. And he raises a good point, because what we're actually going to see in this bill with respect to the export regime is less transparency, less openness, less accountability from the existing regime in place. And so, again, it raises questions about C-47, a bill that arguably waters down the existing regime and, as the honourable member points out, raises questions about openness and transparency with respect to exports.
We have time for a very brief question. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. You hear a lot of the Liberal members, including the Parliamentary Secretary, who suggest that even a simple question on application to hunters and to sport shooters is somehow, to quote his words, bogus or phony. This member and a number of other members have raised some valid questions that hunters, sport shooters have, because a carve-out for civilian users was rejected in the negotiation of this treaty. So I'd like my friend to comment on how suggesting a simple question about application is a bogus argument creates division between rural Canadians, urban Canadians, and really belittles debate in this House. Could the member comment on that?
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton, in 45 seconds or less.
Well, I thank the honourable member for Durham, and he's absolutely right. There has been a lack of a carve-out, and as a result, it has created some very legitimate concerns in light of the vague and ambiguous language contained in the bill. Now, the Liberals shouldn't have signed the treaty before they got that carve-out. That was the position of our government. But even if they went ahead and signed the treaty, at the very least, they could have at least included language in Bill C-47 to raise objection to any interpretation that would result in the application of the treaty to civilian recreational firearms users in Canada.